Imagine grabbing your coffee, heading into work tomorrow morning, and knowing there is a terrifyingly high chance that you or one of your coworkers won't make it home tonight. Seriously, think about that. That wasn't some hypothetical worst-case scenario. It was the brutal, everyday reality of American industrial work just a few decades ago. Hey everyone, I've spent over 15 years in the trenches as a senior EHS manager navigating the real-world complexities of workplace regulations, and today we are unpacking the absolute foundation of it all, the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. We're going to dive deep into the blood-stained OSHA history that literally forced its creation, exactly how the law functions today, and why, as we look toward 2026, the very existence of this legislation is standing at a massive political crossroad. Let's get right into it.
I want you to just stare at this number for a second. 14,000. Prior to 1970, about 14,000 American workers died on the job every single year. And just to be clear, that wasn't over a decade, that was annually. Add to that the nearly 2.5 million workers who suffered disabling injuries every year. Just between 1945 and 1970 alone, over 400,000 Americans were killed by work-related accidents and occupational diseases. To put that into perspective, more Americans were killed in the workplace during that time than in the contemporaneous Vietnam War. The financial cost was, of course, billions in lost wages and production, but the human cost? Completely incalculable.
Section 1. The Crucible, the pre-OSHA safety crisis. You see, before we had federal regulations, workplace safety in the U.S. was this fragmented, state-by-state gamble. If you worked in a high-hazard industry, your safety depended almost entirely on the geographic coordinates of your factory. And that absolute failure of a system set the stage for a really bloody timeline of catastrophic disasters. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York killed 146 garment workers, mostly young women, who were trapped behind locked exit doors. It was horrific, but it finally established the desperate need for basic fire and egress standards. Then, in the 1930s, the Hawks Nest disaster in West Virginia saw hundreds of workers literally suffocate from silicosis after tunneling through high silica sandstone without any respiratory protection. That really highlighted the invisible long-term impact of occupational dust. Fast forward to 1968, the Farmington mine explosion killed 78 miners. That final disaster really galvanized the labor movement. It proved that localized, voluntary safety measures were completely failing, and the public outcry just became deafening. Which brings us to Section 2, the framework, the OSHA Act of 1970.
The ultimate turning point finally arrived on December 29, 1970, when President Richard Nixon signed the William Steger Act into law, initially known as the Safety Bill of Rights, but better known today as OSHA 1970. Now, the really crucial point here is how this framework was actually structured. The architects of the Occupational Safety and Health Act were pretty brilliant in how they separated powers to avoid conflicts of interest. They created a three-pronged federal structure. First, you have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, housed within the Department of Labor, and they are tasked with setting regulations and aggressively enforcing them. Second, you have NIOH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, tasked with conducting independent scientific research on workplace hazards. And third, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, tasked with objective, unbiased data collection. So your enforcers, your scientists, and your statisticians were all operating independently to create this complete, functional safety ecosystem.
Now, this structure builds right into what is arguably the most powerful tool in the entire legislation, Section 5A1, which is universally known as the General Duty Clause. This is your rock-solid catch-all mandate. It states, very clearly, that employers must furnish employment free from recognized hazards causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. So why does this matter so much? Well, because technology and industry move way faster than bureaucracy ever could. OSHA cannot possibly write a specific standard for every single hazard on Earth. The General Duty Clause ensures that even if a highly specific regulation doesn't exist for a brand new hazard, the employer is still legally accountable for protecting their team.
This law fundamentally rewired the relationship between the company and the employee. Under the Act, employers are legally obligated to fulfill strict employer responsibilities. We're talking about providing a hazard-free environment, supplying the necessary personal protective equipment, and conducting extensive safety training. But on the flip side, workers were granted unprecedented worker rights. They got the right to review injury records, the right to request a formal OSHA inspection, the right to whistleblower protections against retaliation, and crucially, the right to refuse imminently dangerous work.
All right, Section 3, the progress, decades of measurable safety.
So, did it work? Well, the data is pretty undeniable. We started this explainer with that 14,000 number from 1970, right? Back then, the workforce was around 56 million people. By 2018, the number of workplace fatalities had plummeted to roughly 5,000. Let that sink in for a second. Fatalities dropped by over 60%, even as the American workforce nearly tripled to 155 million workers. Injury and illness rates dropped from almost 11 incidents per 100 workers in 1972 down to under 3 per 100 workers today. The law absolutely, unequivocally saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
But look, getting to those numbers wasn't without major legal battles. The law had to survive intense Supreme Court crucible tests to really define how it was going to work in the real world. In 1980, the case of Whirlpool Corp v. Marshall unanimously upheld a worker's right to refuse dangerous work. This was after maintenance workers refused to walk on a suspended wire mesh screen that had already failed and killed a coworker. That same year, in American Petroleum Institute v. OSHA, the Supreme Court ruled on benzene exposure limits. They established that OSHA must prove a significant risk actually exists before issuing permanent health standards. This essentially prevented the agency from pursuing completely risk-free workplaces, regardless of the economic cost to the business.
And speaking of economics, the federal government heavily subsidizes safety at the state level to this day. Take a look at this figure, $120,000. That represents the massive annual federal grants required to fund state-administrated occupational safety programs. Right now, 22 states and territories actually operate their own federally approved OSHA state plans. But here's the catch. Under the law, these state plans must be, quote, at least as effective as federal OSHA policies. This federal baseline guarantees that no matter where you do business in the United States, a basic minimum standard of human life is legally protected.
Which brings us to Section 4, the crossroad, the 2025 NASHA Act proposal. So I have a question for you. What happens to the American workplace if the agency that built all these rules literally disappears overnight? Because we're currently standing at a major legislative crossroad. In 2025, Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona reintroduced H.R. 86, known as the NASHA Act. The bill itself is incredibly brief. It consists of just 2 substantive sections, but the purpose is very clear. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970 is repealed, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is abolished. As Representative Biggs stated, OSHA's existence is yet another example of the federal government creating agencies to address issues that are more appropriately handled by state governments and private employers.
Now, as you can imagine, this proposal has sparked a really fierce political debate. Proponents of the NASHA Act argue from a constitutional standpoint of states' rights, asserting that federal regulation of private workplaces is an overreach. They argue that abolishing OSHA would lower burdensome costs for small businesses and allow for much more flexible, market-driven safety programs that are tailored to specific industries. Critics of the bill, however, warn of a regulatory race to the bottom. They argue that without a federal floor, states will basically slash safety standards just to attract business, whistleblower rights will vanish, and that $120 million in federal grants funding state plans, that disappears too, effectively defunding state-level safety enforcement in the process. And we're already seeing this debate trigger major legislative ripples across both red and blue states alike. In Oregon, Republicans sponsored a bill prohibiting the state from adopting rules more stringent than federal OSHA standards. In Kentucky, Democrats actually aimed to repeal safety standards that were previously capped at federal levels. Michigan is attempting to align its civil penalties directly with federal standards, while Nebraska has introduced legislation to completely remove administrative mandates for workplace safety committees. So the landscape of compliance is shifting in real time right before our eyes.
Finally, Section 5, real-world impact and modern relevance.
Regardless of what happens in Washington, D.C., you still have an operation to run today. And here's the bottom line, from someone who has been doing this a long time. Compliance isn't just about avoiding a citation. It's about building a highly profitable, highly functional business. Voluntarily adhering to rigorous safety standards mitigates massive financial liability and devastating lawsuits. It directly lowers your workers' compensation premiums. In an era where corporate transparency is absolute, a safe worksite protects your brand's reputation with clients and the public. And honestly, most importantly, in a really tight labor market, demonstrating a genuine commitment to worker safety ensures the high retention of the skilled labor you desperately need to hit your production targets. Safe businesses are simply better businesses.
We've come a massive way since the days of 14,000 fatalities a year, but the debate over the balance of federal power versus state flexibility is just heating up. The legacy of the Hawks Nest miners and the Triangle Shirtwaist workers is written right there into the General Duty Clause, but the future of how those protections are enforced, well, that remains to be seen.
Will federal workplace safety as we know it survive 2026? It's a question every single industry professional needs to monitor closely. Like, share, and subscribe to HSE Study for more high-impact safety insights.